We toss around words like depressed all the time, right? To talk about a bad day or just feeling kind of down. But in the world of clinical psychology, that word has a really precise, very specific meaning. So today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to unpack it. We're going to look past the casual way we use the word and dive into the official definitions of depressive disorders.
So, where do we even start to find an official definition? Well, for clinicians, it all begins with this one book, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or what everybody just calls the DSM-5. Honestly, you can think of it as the authoritative guide for diagnosing mental health conditions. It provides a common language and a standard set of criteria for everyone working in the field.
And this right here, this gets to the absolute heart of what we're talking about today. We all feel sad. It's a totally normal, fundamental human emotion. But where's the line, At what point does that sadness cross over into something that a doctor would actually diagnose as a depressive disorder? That's the big question we're going to answer.
To really understand that line, we need a reference point. And in the whole world of depressive disorders, the archetype, the one that most people think of, is Major Depressive Disorder, or MDD. So let's start right there. Okay, so right away you can see how specific the clinical definition is. It is not a vague feeling. The DSM-5 gives us two hard and fast rules right at the top. First, there's a time component. It has to last for at least 2 weeks. And second, it has to be a clear change from how a person usually is. It's not a personality trait, it's a distinct episode. So how does a clinician actually figure this out? Well, the DSM-5 breaks it down into a pretty clear formula. It's kind of like a 3-step process. First, you have to have at least one of 2 core key symptoms. Then, you need a handful of other symptoms on top of that. And finally, all of this has to be going on pretty consistently for that 2-week period we just mentioned.
And here's the actual checklist clinicians work from. Now, to even be considered for a diagnosis, a person has to have one of those 2 core symptoms at the top. The first is what we all think of, a depressed mood. But the second one is a really fascinating and crucial concept called anhedonia. Anhedonia is when things that used to bring you joy, maybe it's a hobby, seeing your friends, listening to music, they just suddenly feel flat, uninteresting. Then from there, a diagnosis requires at least 4 more symptoms from this list. And you can see it covers a huge range of experiences, from physical stuff like sleep, either insomnia or its opposite, hypersomnia, which is sleeping way too much, to cognitive things like trouble concentrating, all the way to these profound emotional shifts like feeling worthless.
But here's a critical piece of the puzzle. Just checking off symptoms on a list, that's not enough. The DSM-5 adds this absolutely vital qualifier. The symptoms have to be causing real-world problems. They have to create significant distress or actively get in the way of your job, your relationships, or just your ability to function day to day. This is the component that really separates just having a bad couple of weeks from a diagnosable disorder. Okay, so we've got a handle on major depressive disorder. But MDD, with its intense episodes, is really just one piece of a much bigger picture. See, depression exists on a spectrum. Exactly. While MDD is defined by those clear, really intense episodes, sometimes the experience is different. It can be less severe, but much, much longer lasting. Kind of like a chronic, low-grade hum of depression just sitting in the background of your life. This table lays out the difference perfectly. On one side, you have MDD, and on the other, you have its chronic cousin, persistent depressive disorder, which used to be called dysthymia. And just look at the key differences. Duration, 2 weeks for MDD versus a staggering 2 years for dysthymia. The severity is different too. Dysthymia might have fewer symptoms, but they are incredibly persistent. So you see the pattern, right? One is episodic and intense, the other is chronic and grinding. All right, so now that we've covered the what, the diagnostic criteria for these disorders, let's shift gears. It's time to ask why. What does the science tell us about what's actually going on underneath it all? This quote really just sets the stage perfectly. Just as there isn't one single type of depressive disorder, there isn't one single cause. The idea of a simple one-size-fits-all explanation, it just doesn't hold up to the evidence.
For decades, the popular explanation you probably heard was the chemical imbalance theory, the idea that depression is just a serotonin deficiency. But modern science tells us that, while brain chemistry is definitely involved, that phrase is a massive oversimplification of a much, much more complex reality.
So what did that more complex reality look like? Well, researchers now point to a combination of factors.
There is genetics. Having a family history can significantly increase your risk. There's the brain circuitry, the way different parts of the brain talk to each other. Of course, there are stressful life events that can act as a trigger. And one of the most fascinating new areas of research is the link to inflammation, the body's own immune response. The key takeaway is that these factors don't work in isolation. They all interact in really complex ways.
And you can see this complex interplay of factors when you look at population-level data. For instance, studies consistently find that the lifetime prevalence rates for major depressive disorder are significantly higher in women than in men. The reasons for this are still being debated, and they're probably a mix of biological, hormonal, and social factors. But it's a stark reminder that vulnerability is not one size fits all.
Okay, so we've covered the definitions, the different types, and the complex causes. Let's zoom back out and pull together the most important takeaways from all this.
If there's one thing to take away from our time here, it's this. Whether it's an acute episode of MDD or a long-term case of dysthymia, we are talking about legitimate medical illnesses with real biological and environmental roots. They are not a sign of personal failure or a lack of willpower, period.
And that brings us right back to our original question. Why does all this matter? It matters because having clear scientific criteria based on things like duration, severity, and how it impacts your life gives us the tools to draw that line between the normal ups and downs of life and a clinical condition that requires care and attention. It helps knock down stigma and gives us a path toward understanding.
And we'll end with a thought for the future. Our understanding of these conditions is constantly evolving. I mean, the DSM itself has been revised multiple times over the years. So as neuroscience and genetics give us an even more detailed picture of the brain, you have to wonder, how might these definitions we've just talked about today shift and become even more refined in the years to come?